Hey everyone, welcome to Everything is Dead, the show where we challenge the myths of B2B and uncover how go to market professionals are thriving in channels everyone says are dead. Today we're diving into Outbound with Patrick Spychalski of the Kiln. Me and Patrick have worked together on a few interesting pieces for Clay and Sendspark, and so I respect his opinion and know that he's killing it for people utilizing Outbound as a strategy. Patrick, welcome to the show, mate.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. It's an absolute pleasure. Always love sense.
Yeah, excited to dive in, mate. And I think you're going to have a very unique opinion on this because I view you as the next generation of outbounders or people that do outbound. I think, unfortunately, we're in this kind of weird world where people think that outbound are dead, but it's because they're doing the same boring, tried and tested things that have always been done. So if I gave you that statement, mate, off the rip, outbound is dead, how do you react to that initial statement?
Yeah, I think it's obviously wrong given that, we're doing it successfully, actively. So I know that it is wrong, but I do understand the sentiment behind it. And I definitely do think it's getting harder to do well. Like, I think it's pretty much inarguable that in the beginning of Outbound, when you're able to spray and pray millions of messages to people with like no personalization at all, and people would respond to them, like that was significantly easier than what has to be done now, which is just like very careful, delicate aggregation of lead gen tools, all kind of orchestrating into one outbound motion. But by no means is it dead. And I would actually add that the reason it's so hard is because you now have to add relevant value to your prospects, which makes it effectively better for everybody as a whole.
Yeah, I love that. And I think like we've talked about in the past how you've gone from a role of, hey, let's use a data aggregator and Apollo Zoom Info, pull a list, generic message, shoot it out, and we'll get X number of replies per how many we send out. And so I guess my follow-up question for you would be, why is that change happening? Why has that change occurred? What are the market conditions that are maybe driving it towards this new way of doing outbound?
Yeah, well, I would say the short answer is AI is what is catalyzing this change. It's pretty much impossible for this to change to have been made without AI. Previously, before AI sales tools existed, as you mentioned before, or kind of hinted at, there were just data aggregators. You could get data about prospects, you'd put them into a table, and you had one of two options. You could spray and pray outbound to them with maybe like first name and company name personalizations, because that's all that was technically available at the time. Or you could one by one write a personalized email to people, with SDRs and BDRs and these just legions of salespeople doing all the work for you. Now with AI existing, you're able to kind of bridge the gap between the two and allow for the best of both worlds in theory. The reason it's becoming harder to do is because everybody has access to these tools. And if you have the time to learn them, they're not that expensive and the payoff is pretty massive. And so, in short, AI is catalyzing them. The ability to write outbound messages or create outbound templates that are actually effective and value adding is now upon us. And so, yeah, that's in short what I think is kind of driving this entire thing.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's like an interesting component, and what I want people to get out of this show is like strategies, tools that are actually helping UNC drive demand for clients. And so I know you're a big proponent of Clay. Maybe you could let me like, or at least let the audience know, like what specific strategies or tools are helping you succeed with Outbound in 2024 and moving into 2025.
Yeah, so I'd say there's probably like four main components of running a good outbound motion that you need to get right. The first one is the actual infrastructure itself. When I say infrastructure, I refer to the email domains, the sending domains, and the email accounts you're creating. This is a highly overlooked thing, but it's so insanely important if you don't get this correct, especially for email outbound. Of course, for LinkedIn, it's not a component, but you need that infrastructure for email. The second thing is lead sourcing, being able to create, you still have to create great lead list of prospects and do it correctly. The third thing is personalization and enrichment. So being able to find the correct data on those people and personalize it accordingly. And the fourth thing is a way to actually send those messages. So using a sequencing tool such as Smart Leader instantly, or whatever tool you find to be the most effective to do so. So those are kind of the four main components you need to get right. The reason that those are so drastically changing is because the enrichment and personalization aspect is now just completely been like almost like earthquaked by tools like Clay, where you can now find essentially any data point you want on a company or person at scale, then get that data point, put it into an AI prompt, and have it write like a pretty effective, pretty valuable message, essentially the same message your SDR is probably sending, and send it at scale. And then the deliverability component is getting so difficult because these big sender providers are now cracking down on AI generated messages. It's kind of this back and forth, like push and pull war
Yeah.
between the sender provider and the person doing cold email. AI emails came out and we're like, awesome. They're never gonna be able to detect that we're sending blasts of emails anymore because they're all AI generated and different.
Yeah.
And then the provider's like, actually, never mind. We're able to detect it now. So it's this interesting back and forth for sure.
Yeah, and I love it. I love that you mentioned one thing that I think is overlooked broadly, and actually tools are making it easier now, like Smartly have launched new features for the infrastructure component, because I actually think that is something that the majority of actually large companies tend to miss on. And it's, you could have all the other three things totally nailed in. Like, you spent ages getting a really enriched lead list, you've written great copy, you're sending it out, but it's never landing in the inbox. And it's so weird to me that people don't consider that as like the first step. Just touching on that, talking about infrastructure, because it's actually a hot topic at the moment. I hear more and more about what are kind of like your best practices. And say if I was a client coming on board with the Kiln, what would the steps you'd go through to actually make sure that my infrastructure is set up correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I will say is I genuinely don't think it's an exaggeration to say that 95% of companies have bad email infrastructure. They're probably getting terrible deliverability, terrible open rates. If you're not getting like above 60% open rates, at least, maybe even higher for other campaigns, you're probably doing it wrong. And a lot of the companies I've talked to, and these aren't small companies, these are like,
I know. The reason I laugh about this, and it's not funny, but like going back even 4 years, I worked for a Series B tech company, and they just started to do outbound sales. They hired a BDR team, and they were using their primary domain, and it just, like, the main domain just went. And it's just stuff that, like, it blows your mind at Series B. That's the thing. Like,
oh yeah, I mean, one of our clients is a $2 billion a year company in revenue, and they had the worst email infrastructure I'd seen. We had to scrap all of their accounts, and it's like, that $2 billion a year of resources, and it wasn't right. And so you can imagine what you see in the startup phase, which is people who have less time to allocate to that stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, the way we generally look at it is the first thing we'll do is audit your existing accounts. Generally, you're probably not going to have email accounts and domains that are good, but we'll give it a look just in case. If you have them and they actually do work, maybe like a 20% chance they usually do, then we can use them, and great. If they don't work, then we have somebody on our team who sets them up, and we do this all completely manually. The reason for that is I'm very iffy on the automatic email creation tools because the deliverability landscape is changing so much all the time. I'm very skeptical they're able to make product changes that fast to adjust to those changes in the deliverability landscape. So we actually have somebody on the team whose full-time job, like all day, is create those accounts, manage them, make sure they're delivering properly, which just involves, finding domains from the right place, creating Microsoft and Gmail accounts, and setting up the SPF, the DKIM, DMARC, all that stuff properly.
Cool. Yeah, I love it, mate. And again, even that is, I'd say, the right way to do it, but not a lot of organizations are going to have the patience. And it takes balls to go into an organization with $2 billion, like a $2 billion revenue number, and say, actually, what you've been doing is terrible. And you need to start. So I just think it's interesting that regardless of the scale, that's one thing probably everybody listening to this should be asking their SDR manager. And again, who does this fall under? Because actually, what's interesting about what I just said is the average SDR manager at an enterprise company does not have the technical ability to even think through that, I'd imagine, right? Who's responsible? Who should be responsible?
The tough part is it's actually usually, like, no matter the size of the company, the head of sales. And the problem with that is, of course, they're not usually thinking about things that granular. They're thinking like high level sales tactics. And I'll go back to that one client that does $2 billion a year. I had to get in like essentially a war with them over everything I did because they were, again, a $2 billion a year, 9,000 person company. And I'm going in there and telling them everything you're doing needs to be completely revamped and it's all wrong. And you need to listen to me, the agency owner who you just started working with.
Yeah, because that's going to cost us another 3 months of retainer, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, we need to create new accounts. We need to start using new tools. We need to start sourcing leads from different places. We need to completely redo all of your copy. And while it was a war, it ended up, in our first 3 months with them, we generated them $14 million in pipeline.
Yeah, that's a good return on investment then if you're getting that.
Yeah, so then suddenly they were like, maybe we should focus more on this stuff. But to answer your question before, it's the head of sales. And the reason for that is because the SDR manager shouldn't be responsible for that kind of stuff. It actually should be somebody higher up, focusing on the overall organizational infrastructure with regards to their email sending.
Yeah, love it, mate. And so taking those things into consideration, you gave us like 4 very clear things that people should be doing. Is there like a really good campaign or a tactical play from an outbound standpoint that's generating great results from you? And it could be like, I know you've mentioned lookalike campaigns before. I know you've mentioned, is there any kind of creative approaches to outbound that you're utilizing right now that the audience could also maybe utilize to generate demand?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to probably answer that question in a different way than most people, which is I think you should have you should be using essentially the following framework. High volume email campaigns, while intuitively are a lot more effective, you would think, the lower volume email campaigns that we've been running do significantly better, not even just from a relative positive response rate. So, maybe 1 in every 100 respond from a high volume, then 5 in every 100 respond from a low volume. But even like actual volume of positive responses, we're getting better from low volume campaigns.
Yeah.
The reason for that is a few things. The first thing is obviously you can target them significantly better and write more targeted copy. And the second thing is the reason these campaigns are low volume is because we're getting leads from really interesting sources. And so I'll give a few examples. The first one that you mentioned before, we got to have a system for all of our clients where we'll get all of their best customers, find lookalikes of them, and then reach out in a small campaign saying, hey, X company is our customer already, and we've done this result for them. You're their direct competitor. You obviously have the need for our product or service. Do you want to buy it?
And it's not this one, right? And I think you've even said that to me before, like you will disqualify anybody from working with you who don't have a few really solid customer case studies, which is smart.
Yeah, exactly. And then another one would be any sort of like warm lead engagement. So for example, we do LinkedIn engagement campaigns where we can either get the company's LinkedIn account, a person's LinkedIn account, so maybe they have like somebody with 20, 30,000 followers within their organization, or a competitor's LinkedIn account and scrape all of their engagement live and then reach out to the people who engage with them, make sure they're ICP qualified. And if they are ICP qualified, then say, hey, I saw you engage with X post.
I love it.
You might be interested in X, and then run campaigns on them. And so in short, we have a playbook of like dozens of these ideas, but the high level thought here is approach outbound kind of counterintuitively, try to reach out to as few people as possible. Maybe not as few as possible. We don't want zero, but don't reach out to 10,000 people on your first campaign. Maybe narrow down to a list of 500 with really targeted copy and make sure the lead list is like really solid.
Yeah, I love it. I love it, mate. Yeah. I think what's interesting about what you just said, and actually it's a follow-up question, which is with the new tooling out there, like there's new tooling all the time that is supposedly, and it's being created as a result of the struggles that people are having with outbound fundamentally. And so you have, to your point, you called out social triggers. There's a lot of platforms now where you can, like Triggerfy, for example. Like there's a lot of platforms that you can pick up on social triggers and run outbound against, right? There's website de-anonymization tools like RB2B, Vector, some other platforms like that. There's Common Room, which now has like a bunch of signals, right? I think one of the things that unfortunately is happening is there are lots of things that you can do. And so I guess my question for you would be, whether it's advice to people listening in or even what you're doing with your current customers, are you approaching it systematically and running like, this is the highest chance of success campaign. We're going to run this first, test it, and then move on to a second? Or are you running all of these in parallel?
Yeah. And so obviously there has to be some sort of prioritization. Like as an agency, we can only work on maybe 1 to 2 projects at a time. And so the way in which we figure out which projects to run, it depends, first of all, on whether it's a warm lead campaign or a cold lead campaign. And so we'll start with warm leads. Warm leads, in short, are essentially leads that are found from some sort of marketing initiative. You got to think of it that way. Like LinkedIn leads are just, you're using LinkedIn as a marketing tool and you're getting those leads from the marketing tool and doing outbound towards them. And so the first thing we ask a client is, what are your best marketing initiatives right now? Are they webinars? Are they podcasts that people are commenting and liking on? Is it your LinkedIn? When we figure that out first, because usually the best marketing initiative you're running is where you should go find those warm leads from.
I'm a firm believer in that. It's crazy to me that once you find a channel that works, invest more time, energy in those channels fundamentally.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you don't have a good LinkedIn audience, don't use Triggerfy to scrape LinkedIn engagers.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also like where your audience active. I think that's one thing that's come up in almost every call, which is like marketing 101, which is, okay, who's your ICP? Like, where are they active? What channels are they consuming content? But also what channels are they receptive to messaging on as well? Like, to your point, it's like everybody thinks that building in public, LinkedIn is the way to go. But you're selling to home services clients. It's like, it's totally the wrong. Like Facebook could probably be a platform. So I think that's like just a good point for everybody listening, which is sometimes LinkedIn DMs aren't going to be a good campaign for you to generate demand from.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also tough because you'll see videos on LinkedIn from people doing some of this fancy warm outbound stuff. And we even have clients sometimes that'll just like screenshot it and they'll be like, we should do this. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes we're like, actually, we should do this. And then sometimes I'm like, well, how many LinkedIn followers do you have? And they're like 300. And I'm like, well, probably shouldn't run a campaign then because half of them are probably your friends and the other half has to be qualified, right? So definitely important to look at. And then when we're looking at cold outbound campaigns, it's really just contingent on how good we think their offer is. Like if we think their offer is incredible, like something that will just rip anywhere, we go high velocity. I'm not saying don't go high velocity, but I would say you usually want to start low velocity. But if you have an incredible offer, like, if you respond to my email, I'll give you $1 million. It's like, let's just send out as many of those as possible, because why wouldn't somebody respond to that? But if they don't have a great offer, you get a little fancier with your approach, start going down a lower velocity, and think more about either the value add you can bring in an email if your offer isn't good, or a way to stand out. So Sendspark, like if you're running campaigns and you don't think you can really improve your offer that much more without it just being like, I'm losing money by running this outbound initiative, and you need to stand out, like Sendspark's a great way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're spot on there. The other component, which I'd love to get your feedback on, and actually it's something that I always hear, I would say 90% of the sales calls I'm on for Sendspark is we need to improve our outbound. Like legitimately, like that is the main thing. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. I think people struggle for all the reasons you've mentioned, but then also the actual delivery of your offer is so important as well. And so I think copywriting gets you part of the way there. But for some audiences, and this is what I always go back to, and I'll argue this all day long, you have no idea in what format your target audience prefers to consume content in. And that's why, like, I'm a big proponent of multi-touch, like cold call, LinkedIn DM, email, like video. Try it all, because actually, like, to get hold of me as a buyer, cold call me. I pick up cold calls all day long, right?
Yeah.
Cold emails, I barely touch, to be totally honest, because that's just my buyer preference. So that's the layer of this, which I also find a bit more nuanced, because even if you have a killer offer, you're targeting really good lead list, if you're still not reaching them in the medium that they prefer, you're going to struggle as well, to be totally honest.
Yeah, I absolutely 100% agree with that take. You really never know. And you'll also write off outbound really prematurely if you don't give due diligence to every channel that you're running. Like, we had a great example with a client where we were reaching out to executives of Fortune 500 companies, which is a notoriously difficult ICP to get a hold of. But obviously, like, their deal sizes were like 7 figures if they could close one. So. And we tried email, and we ran like thousands and thousands of emails, and we got like maybe 3 or 4 positive responses from the campaigns. And I was like, shoot, like, I really thought this messaging was good. We did LinkedIn, exact same messaging on LinkedIn, like skyrocketing results. It's unreal.
Like, it's so true. And I think that's where it also comes into. And so here's the other piece that I'd love to get your opinion on. And again, tactical takeaway for people, because I'd imagine actually that the majority of people listening to this, everybody is struggling to some extent with outbound. Like, I rarely meet people that are like, we're freaking absolutely crushing outbound.
Yeah.
So, like, you mentioned something interesting, which is a lot of people I feel like will run one big volume campaign, right? 10,000 emails, not get any responses, then it's cold email doesn't work. What, like, for you is like the point where you might make that decision to say, actually, cold email might not be the best channel? Do you know what I mean? What kind of things or signals are you looking at to actually discount email and maybe move to a different channel?
Yeah, it's a really tough answer to apply. I would say blanket. The only reason for that is people, when they're attempting to do something, generally think they've done it all far before they have. And so, like, if you're a sales org and you're running outbound, you might be using, let's say, Apollo, and your open rates are 10% and your reply rates are like 0.005%. And you think to yourself, well, I've tried so many different campaign types in Apollo and it's not working. And it's like, well, you shouldn't give up just yet. But I will say, let's just say you have all of the tool stack kind of down and you're getting great open rates. You're getting like 60+% open rates on your outbound campaigns, and you've run like 10 different campaigns to your ICP and you know they're your ICP. Then you start considering that. Like, I just think people give up far too early. I mean, we as an agency try to run one campaign per week per client generally. Obviously that changes in certain phases of the year, but the thought is, like, we tell our clients it's not even worth considering outbound not working as a channel until we hit the 2-month mark. If we hit the 2-month mark, we've run about 7 to 8 campaigns. And if you still haven't seen results, then we're pretty confident outbound as a channel doesn't work for you, period, because we're getting great open rates. We have like best-in-class copywriters. We have proven results from all of our other clients. And so we know what works, and it's actively working, and it's still not going well for you. In that case, then give up. And then I would try another channel. That's the funny thing. Don't even just stop email and go try LinkedIn or something. You know?
Cold call, the same type of messaging.
Exactly.
Do that. So here's something that I just think is an interesting component, again, which is I'm set here as an SDR leader. I'm struggling with cold outbound. Like, people like you are obviously, as I mentioned at the start, next generation, I'd say, understands signals, understands all these things that are, like, I'd say relatively new still to the market. if you're sat there and you've got a 10-person SDR team, what is like a basic thing that you would recommend them do today in seat just to improve what they're doing by a percentage or a couple of percent? What is like the building block, in your opinion, that they can start from to get good results?
Yeah, I'd say two things. The first one we already touched on, which is deliverability. I
Yep.
think you need to improve your deliverability. That is like the biggest low hanging fruit, no brainer, but I think most companies either ignore it or haven't fit
What
out.
tools can people use? And again, I want to give people tools they can go. If they're not like you and they're scientific in the way that they're warming these inboxes up and getting good deliverability, like what other providers or what other experts are out there to help them do this?
Yeah, so one thing I would recommend looking at, especially if you're like just getting started and you don't want to get fancy with it, is Instantly has a tool actually where you can go buy email domains and accounts within the tool. You can warm them up, their Gmail and Microsoft accounts, and probably the easiest way to get started would be going there. I would say they work significantly better than 90% of other providers that I've found. Again, we like to do it manually still, but if you don't want to do it manually, this still works really well.
Yeah.
So deliverability would be the first thing. The second thing would be probably the messaging. The second thing that I see so many teams mess up is their outbound copy. And there's a few things that are usually wrong with it. The first thing that I always see is that it's too long. It's like every single time I get into a company's copy, it's like this essay about
words.
how
I think Will Alred just says like 50 words or less is ideal.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just like I see like an essay about the company and like the founder's like childhood, and you're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like we actually have a practice in our agency with copy where when we write copy, we go over it 3 separate times and we tell ourselves, is this the shortest this sentence can possibly be? And are these words the most simple words to describe this
Grade
thing as
reading level,
possibly?
right? As well. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
help you get more leads. Like
Yeah.
that would be great. Like it shouldn't be like we use like proprietary outbound
Yeah.
techniques and
Yeah.
technology to drive synergy. Like no, like it's not like a McKinsey PowerPoint. It is
Yeah.
the exact opposite of that. You should be writing to a 5-year-old. That's how it
Love,
works. So
love
I
it.
would look into that as well.
Simplified copy, deliverability. I love it. Those are cool. Those are two really good takeaways. Patrick, like I said, I think Outbound is very much alive, and I think people like you are spearheading that movement with some really creative strategies. Appreciate you jumping on. If anybody wants to follow Patrick or the Kiln, great content on LinkedIn, and we'll attach those kind of in the show notes. Patrick, any last advice for people out there that are wringing their hands from an outbound standpoint?
No, other than check out Clay. It's tough to use, but a lot of value add. So
Magic. We use the Sendspark as well, so that's a plus one on
yeah,
my side.
and try Sendspark because we
And
use
try
it.
Sendspark, obviously. Yeah, Clay and
Yeah.
Sendspark together is super powerful. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you again on another episode.
All right, appreciate it, Ben. Have a good one.